Bioware has had a string of bad luck in the gaming sphere lately. Bad reception on Mass Effect Andromeda, and even worse on their new IP, Anthem. That said, Bioware used to be considered an absolute juggernaut of a narrative games studio. Creating a lot of narrative, choice-driven RPGs, they have become synonymous with that field of games. Want to play as Commander Shepard of the Normandy? Get a crew and save the galaxy? How about finding yourself in the politically driven story of Dragon Age, with all its magic, factions, and fantasy? What if they were both choice-driven with a huge variety of characters that you could see in real life that get character development over an entire series of games? What if you could name your dog something that would make GigaChad himself jealous? That's right, I named him Barbaricus. This was Bioware's specialty, making worlds that you would want to be in, worlds that have an incredible cast of characters, all with different motives and personalities. Worlds that felt absolutely lived in, with major story beats happening with or without you as you continue on. This isn't to say that Bioware didn't hit snags before their recent games. One of them is the topic of today, Dragon Age 2. Now, in the world of Dragon Age, there are a lot of moving parts and factions that make it feel big and alive. If you search something Dragon Age related, I'll bet most random user posts will be about a character or two from the games. This franchise is huge. So first things first, why am I here talking about Dragon Age 2? And what does it need defending from? I first played Dragon Age 2 all the way back in 2011, the year it launched. I haven't touched it since. I remember liking the game and characters, bits and pieces of the story, and even the gameplay. But what has sat in the back of my mind for all these years was seeing how the game had a more negative reaction to it compared to the other games in the series. I received an overall score of 82 on Metacritic, yet the user score was less than stellar. I wondered why that was. Just what were the reasons that people had complaints over it? I took to the internet to research what these various complaints were, going through written reviews of the game to that of forum responses from other players. A lot of the issues seem to be similar from one site to the next and are summed up pretty well in a Reddit post I stumbled upon. So we're going to take a look at what people have stated about the game and see if these points have any merit to them or not. I did a full playthrough of the game for this and have my opinions on it. Do I agree with the points given, or do I believe there's something better there? Let's see how these stack up. I'm here to speak in defense of Dragon Age 2. Alright, on to the list of community sentiment. The combat change to a more action style. Companions not being liked, or a hassle to further their quests. More linear story and lack of consequences. The city of Kirkwall not changing over the span of the story. Companion armors not changeable. Reused maps and locations. And finally, the story felt more like setup to Dragon Age Inquisition than an actual installment. These were all the major points or issues that popped up a lot that I found made it into a lot of reviews and critiques. So let's dive right in and see if these points have any merit to them. So the first point is the combat and how it switched to a more action style of gameplay. When Dragon Age 2 was released, the only game in the franchise that fans played was Dragon Age Origins. That game had a tactical style of combat to it that people resonated with. It had a pause feature to help you order around your party to do different tasks. You could set one character to taunt a group of enemies, while one was healing and others were damaging them in a traditional role-based type of combat. You didn't just have control of one character, you had control of all of the party. If you switched to another character, the AI would then control your character until you do something with them specifically. Your character would auto-attack, and you could use skills that your class would learn over time. Telling your companions to use skills in certain areas or on specific enemies would help the tide of battle for you. It had a sort of tab target MMO feel to it. Sounds tactical, right? Well, everything I mentioned there also happens to be in Dragon Age 2, on PC. While Dragon Age 2 came out on both consoles and PC, I guess they were both made with different gameplay in mind. This was the Xbox 360 and PS3 era of consoles, so keyboard and mouse was a no-go. The weird part is that, inversely, PC doesn't have controller support outside of add-ons. So, taking that into consideration, that would essentially make this point valid towards that of console versions. It's a bit more complicated on PC as the transition from Origins to 2 was much closer. In combat, you have some essentials to look for. The classes being different also gives you access to different skills. Add in specializations and it further takes the class you play as into a direction that other players might not have. Area of effects, single target, freezing enemies allowing melee allies to do massive amounts of damage, it's all there. Planning and strategizing still exist in a good way. There's got a few issues where sometimes your skills won't go off when you click, but other than that, it works as intended. I did this playthrough on PC, so my experience in the gameplay is in the footage you see now. Skills that you and your team can use, pausing combat to issue orders and take control of your allies, lots of enemies to take on, and so on. It has its challenges for sure, as well as some questionable ideas for some enemies having nearly one-shot attacks and whatnot. It's still a fun time overall, and on PC, it still had a tactical approach to combat that the community sentiment said it didn't. So the way I see it, that point is more made for the console version of the game. Even with that, this is a point that can be seen as an issue, for its time. As the years go by, more games come out, and more people seem to prefer action-oriented combat than ever before. So if the game came out today, that might not have been such a big point. The AAA market is absolutely flooded with more action-oriented games because they sell easier to a broader audience. Final Fantasy, as an example, has gone from their turn-based systems that helped make the series to the action-style gameplay for this reason alone. Overall, I really enjoyed the combat myself as it was fun, engaging, challenging, and rewarding. Being able to plan and strategize in ever-changing fights definitely felt great to me, and it didn't overstay its welcome. With all that in mind, I think I'd chalk this up as a 50-50. It seems to be something more associated with consoles than on PC. So that is combat checked. On to the next point. The companions not being liked or a hassle to further their quest lines. The first half of this point is far more subjective than the second half. Companions not being liked will always come down to the individual in question, unless of course said companion is actually terribly written and hated by every player. Since the Dragon Age franchise is built on narrative and character development, it's only natural that companions are a big part of the game. Get their personalities to be unlikable, and that's what you can expect. There are 10 companions in the game. These are characters that you can talk to, help, make stronger, and even romance. These are characters that drive the story forward in their own ways. If they were written badly, it would affect more than just the character themselves. It would affect the overall story. I was fine with all the characters and found their little quips and chats with each other to be funny. Varric is definitely a favorite of mine for sure. He's a slick dwarf that has a crossbow named Bianca. Anytime someone asks why he named his crossbow Bianca, he gives some sly remarks or jokes and dodges the overall question.
Bianca is a very pretty name.
I'll tell her you said so, Daisy.
She can't actually hear you, can she?
Of course she can. What kind of question is that?
Wait, are we talking about your crossbow or something else now?
He's got his charm, and Bianca is the only weapon he can use in the game. He writes stories that people come to love, and boy, does he love to tell Hawk's story in a variety of exciting ways.
When you tell people about our escape from Lothering, why do you make it sound like I had food all over my face?
You're larger than life, Hawk. I had to give you a few flaws just to make you approachable.
Did you just call me fat?
Yes, that's pretty much how I tell it. Hawk rolled into the fray like a gigantic pudding covered in gravy. It's more dramatic that way.
I'm not sure about the epicness of this tale.
Everyone's a critic.
This is just one character, and he's fleshed out with not only a personality, but also the ties with other characters and story beats to boot. Whenever you see Varric, you know who he is, and likely a general idea of what he could say. He's like that friend you know that can always make you laugh and uses sarcasm a majority of the time he talks. A character that I basically put in my party nearly 24/7 because I liked him. Varric aside, are there any characters I could say that I didn't enjoy? I can say no to that. All the characters have their own personalities, quirks, and ties to story that make them all unique. While that doesn't necessarily mean they can't be unliked, Making a full team of copy and paste allies tends to make a story boring when they are all saying the same things. These characters have their own likes, dislikes, and their conversations with each other while you're just walking around with them in your party go on to show themselves even further. You can have two allies that don't actually vibe very well together. They'll still get the job done at the end of the day, mostly because you control them and their abilities, but when they talk with each other, you can really see who they are to each other. Sometimes putting up with each other because Hawk is the anchor for the team. Hawk, the player, has a more reactionary role in the story. Because of this, the plot is what moves them forward. Major plot points will be going on that require choices and dialogue from the player. Whatever these choices are, your companions will have opinions on them, positive or negative. This is another aspect that makes these characters unique, as their future dialogue is dependent on whether they have a good or bad relationship with Hawk. Again, this is a more subjective point. I enjoyed the various characters and their escapades, but that doesn't mean they're perfect. Obviously, as this wouldn't be a point of contention otherwise. As for being a hassle to further their quest lines, it seemed to mostly come down to how far apart they all are. While there's an instance of two of them overlapping, they tend to be a few loading screens apart from each other. They're mostly all in different locations. While their locations make sense as to where you would find them, having to travel to them can be seen as an issue there as well. While I played on PC, the load times weren't that bad, but back on PS3 and Xbox 360, loading generally took longer to do. Because of this, I can agree that this is a more negative point. While it did build the characters further by also being in their preferred locations, it still had to be dealt with. So now we can check this off our list. Next point, a more linear story and a lack of consequences from choices. This is a point that I can agree with. The story does feel more linear. There's not really that many branching paths made from your choices, as the endpoint is still, ultimately, the same no matter how you play. Where the branches do come from is how you go from point A to point B. Follow Varric's questline, then fight the Kunari, then Aveline's questline, or switch it up, Aveline, Varric, Kunari. And yes, technically you have to wait until certain times and friendship levels to get these quests, but they are still connected and branch in different orders. It doesn't make it a less linear story from this, just that your journey from beginning to end may be unique from your friends. It's still an overall linear storyline with a few choices and consequences that show up changing how it goes. Some of the choices in the game tell you to pick a side. These can be tough depending on how you're role-playing. Even with these choices, all it does is change some aspects of the mural screens at the end. That said, even with the story being in a more linear format, it's still something that just caught my interest and never let go. I heard that Bioware was pushing this game out as fast as possible, but if this is the quality of story that we got, I kind of wish we got to see something they could make with more time in the oven. The story works in 3 acts. Each act is a time skip. There's stuff that happens between each act that you don't see, but you will hear it as little side notes in conversations with companions from time to time. Act 1 is Hawk's family trying to get better lives in Kirkwall. Act 2 is dealing with Kunari politics, honestly, the most polished story part in my opinion. Finally, Act 3 is Mages vs. Templars. They're all unique and help to influence each other subtly throughout the main story. However, it's still done in a linear fashion. You don't get to pick and choose what order the story is told in, or how it's told. And the more permanent choices are either made late in the story, or a dead character is just replaced with another one. This is definitely a point I see going towards the community sentiment here, and we can check this off our list. Next up, Kirkwall, the city we play in, not changing over the span of the story. Alright, so the story takes place over 6 years. This point is stating that the overall city doesn't change at all. You see the same sights, the same people, in the same places. Now while this is true, there are still a few things that do change. Some characters will, spoiler alert, die. Thus, if you saw them in the same spot after that event happened, it would break immersion. When the story takes place over a span of years, you would expect some changes to help keep immersion in the story, even if it's someone changing their outfit or doing something else. Adding in visual differences will always help in a scenario like this. At one point, the Kunari attack the entire city itself. Hawk fights back and wins. After that event, if you go back to where the Kunari were staying at, you'll find that the area is boarded up and you can no longer go into it. Regardless of how the point tries to spin that, it is a change in the city. Is it enough changes to elicit 6 years of change? Definitely not. Does it mean there's no changes? Also definitely not. However, if I were to put my 2 cents into this, I would say that I didn't really think it mattered all that much to me. Would changing how things and people looked over time made the experience better? Yes, absolutely. Does not doing so kill the game for me? Definitely not. My thoughts on this point are in saying there is merit to the claim, as I see the players were telling the truth here. But I also say that even with this, it's not a deal breaker in playing and enjoying the game. This point is now checked. Next up, companion armors cannot be changed. So let's look at this from a couple different angles. If we look at it from the time the game launched, Dragon Age Origins was still relatively new, and it allowed you to change what armor your companions were wearing. Dragon Age 2 doesn't actually allow that. In fact, you can't change the armor at all. This does take a level of customization away from the player in determining how their allies look. Not only that, but you also can't give them random pieces of armor you find on your journey to boost up their defenses or give them bonuses. Since Origins was only released a few years earlier, this can be seen as a downgrade, kind of like a feature they took away. If you look at this nowadays though, there are more games doing this very thing, like for example, Fallout 4. While you can equip armor onto allies in that, their look doesn't change. In Dragon Age 2, the developers have some of your allies change armor designs, though this is tied to story progression. This is something that does tend to let your allies feel more real as they have their own designs and aren't just mannequins that you puppet around all the time. So for this, the point is correct that you can't change their armor looks. For me personally, it doesn't bother me at all. I've played plenty of games where this is a thing, so not making someone wear pink armor isn't that bad. It doesn't break my immersion with the game whatsoever, so there's that. This is probably another thing that comes down to personal preference. If you like playing dress up with your companions, then this won't be a good game for you. That aside, this point is now checked. Alright, this is a big one. Reused maps and locations. By reused, I don't mean taking the map from some location in Dragon Age Origins. This is mostly about how there's only so many locations in the game that you can travel to. Quests will take you to places you've already seen many times. Kirkwall may be a city, but it's got its sub-districts that you travel to and from doing various things. Dragon Age 2 also came out during the Xbox 360 and PS3 era of games. Those consoles were powerful at the time, but now they're severely lacking in comparison to today, for obvious reasons. This means that there was only so much that the games could take advantage of when being made. Skyrim and other open world games were considered a rarity on that generation. Most games would take a more segmented level approach to their map design. Even with all of that, I'll tell you that the developers do try some workarounds. Workarounds such as changing map routes and day and night locations. Let's talk about the map routes first. So with this concept, you could go into a cave with a lot of pathways. These pathways will either take you forward or be a dead end with loot in it. Now, let's say you go into the same cave for another quest. Some of those pathways will be blocked both times you enter. It essentially makes it a slightly different cave each time you go in. Is it a perfect solution? No. Is it passable? I'd say yes, because there's still quite a few locations giving you different sites and enemies to fight. As for the day and night locations, this is mostly involved with Kirkwall and its sub-districts. If you go to a location during the day, you'll see a lot of people around and sometimes get attacked. At night, however, very few people are out and about and the enemy count goes up a lot. It's definitely a nicer change that adds a bit more variety to the various areas you travel to and from. So, is there any merit to this sentiment? I would say yes and no. Yes, by the fact that you do revisit areas a lot. No, because it's not like I was in the various areas 5 or more times each from quests. Sure, it's not perfect, but I personally never got tired from seeing the same location, and that's my 2 cents on that, so we can count that done. Check mark. And finally, the final point at last, finally. The story felt more like setup to Dragon Age Inquisition than a full-on installment of the series. This point works a bit differently. I could agree that it was set up for Inquisition, but isn't that the point of every game that leads into a sequel? Mass Effect 1 was set up for Mass Effect 2. Borderlands 1 was set up for Borderlands 2. This isn't exactly anything inherently groundbreaking or wrong with the game, but let's look a bit deeper than that. Take Inquisition out of our heads as it didn't exist back in 2011. Dragon Age 2, from start to finish, is, in fact, a complete story. Shock and awe. all seriousness though, when Dragon Age 2 was released, it was with the intention of it being a full game. However, before release, it was apparently going to be an expansion of Dragon Age Origins. This fact makes me wonder if that's what people read and latched onto, with saying it had more of a DLC feel to it than a full game. The writing that's there felt great to me. Everything felt fleshed out with the writer's intentions being laid bare for all to see. Yes, I do believe it has some issues in how it's presented, such as Act 3 having the conflict between mages and Templars go from a 5 straight to an 11. It did feel like it was breakneck speed in that regard. Other than that, I had a lot of intrigue with the story bits that I wanted to look up to know more. Not to mention, now that I know what happens in Inquisition, I had a moment when I heard the Dalish talk about the Dreadwolf.
May the Dreadwolf never catch your scent.
Alright, so did the story feel like setup for Inquisition? Yes. Did it feel like a full game and more like an expansion? I'd say no. That's my personal takeaway from this bit here. I loved what story was there, getting into the politics of the world, dealing with the Arishok who actually brings up some great points, seeing the beginning of the Mage Rebellion. It's all there and knows what it is. Checkmark. So, to sum up my opinions on this, yes, I do believe there are flaws in the game that could have been done better. Do all the points have merit? Yes, and to an extent. Does that make it a bad game? In my honest opinion, no. The game is great. The gameplay is a ton of fun, the characters are memorable in fantastic ways, and the story is very interesting. From my experience, I did not want to put the game down. This may have been my second playthrough, but it's not like I remembered every little detail of the story before this. I was surprised by things I didn't remember, seeing the various story beats and how some of the skills felt. One of my favorite takeaways from this game was seeing the friend and rival system with your companions. Making decisions your allies didn't approve of didn't mean that they would flat out leave you, but more so become more of a rival figure to Hawke. Their dialogue would change in a lot of conversations, and it really just helped to cement who they were, their motives, likes and dislikes, and so on. The system absolutely helped to make them feel more alive and believable. It doesn't mean it was perfect, of course. There's still some issues people had with some of the characters in how they were written. That likely wouldn't be fixed with this system, but still, props to the devs for making this deeper than I thought possible. All in all, I loved my time in the game. It might not have the same replayability that Origins or Inquisition do, but it's still a fantastic time playing. So now, I open the floor to you all. Do you agree with my thoughts on the community sentiments? Do you think I missed something major? Tell me in the comments below. This is also the first video in my more recent changes to this series. I'd love to know your thoughts on if this is a better overall direction, and if it was informative enough. It's still a work in progress to find the best formula for this, but with all things, it needs to evolve. Heck, if there are games you loved and believe are hated unjustly, let me know in the comments and I might have a look at it for this series. Not all games reviewed poorly are actually bad. Let's see what others pop up.